So Persona 3 Remake is on the horizon for early 2024, and it's genuinely some of the best news that I've gotten in months. Like many Persona fans, I've wanted a remake for this game ever since I played it all those years ago. And after multiple years of speculation, rumors, and discussion, the copium is finally over. Despite it getting leaked like 3 days before its official announcement, I was still pretty excited to see it get announced at the Xbox Game Show, as we would get our hands on an HD trailer to really enjoy. And the trailer was amazing, showing just enough to get a really good idea of how this remake is going to be, with its flashy and stylish menus, revamped battle UI, and even new music giving Lotus Juice's new song in the trailer. And they even start off the trailer with a really scenic shot of Aiga staring off into the ocean, which in the original would be the scene when you meet her for the first time. She also happens to be my favorite fictional character from Persona 3, so with how they used this shot specifically to open up the trailer really sold it for me. Now as for what this means for Persona 3 specifically, this has potential to be absolutely huge. Just for context, Persona 3 was when the Persona series took a major turning point in the franchise. Persona 1 and 2 were more like SMT games in terms of its gameplay and themes, and when Persona 3 came out, it shifted everything into a new direction. It introduced social links, a new battle system, free roam, time management, and many more. It felt like a breath of fresh air given the usual kind of games Atlus were making at the time, and it was also really unique with its presentation. The whole social sim combined with turn-based dungeon crawling was something already seen in Japan, but extremely new in the West, creating a dedicated fanbase of people wanting more games like Persona 3. Then with the release of Persona 3 FES a year later, it would add new quality of life changes, but most notably The Answer, which is a 25-hour plus continuation after the events of Persona 3. Then a couple years later we would have Persona 3 Portable, which would be a port of Persona 3 but for the PSP. Being reworked for the small handheld, it would lose its cutscenes in 3D environments in favor of a more simplified 2D approach, but it would also add things such as party control and, for the main appeal of it, an entirely new female main character with a bunch of new content catered towards her. While The Answer was used to truly wrap up the story of Persona 3, it doesn't really have too much of a positive reception, as a lot of people just weren't a big fan of it, story and gameplay wise. With all of this, Persona 3 is easily the weirdest game in the series, as it's never had a definitive edition with every piece of content in one game. I have noticed that there are extreme fans of both ports for the different benefits that each title brings. With all of this and the story of Persona 3 being loved by many for its dark themes and oppressive atmosphere, it's kinda natural that Persona 3 would reach number 1 on Atlus's survey for most wanted to remake. That and Persona 2, which honestly would be amazing to see it remade someday. And with Persona 3 Reload officially announced, this can be the definitive edition that it desperately needed, but with time. The developers of the remake have went out and said that Persona 3 Reload will be a remake of the original Persona 3, which means no FEMC from Portable or the Answer sequel from FES. As disappointing as it is to learn that the remake won't have added content from either game, it's really not the end of the world. I don't think this is something that Atlus is going to pass up on entirely, as they know how badly the fans want a female main character again, or some sort of iteration of the Answer. People have been asking for the female main character to get properly added in HD for years, and I think that in the long run, all of these features will be added to Reload, but unfortunately as DLC or in some later installment. Atlus has always had a DLC problem, and this is more noticeable in games like Persona 5 and the Nocturne remaster, where in Nocturne's case, certain story content was literally locked behind a paywall. I can definitely see Atlus adding The Answer as an expansion DLC somewhere down the line, with maybe even a new or revamped story, as the old one wasn't too favorable with the fanbase. As for the portable editions like the female main character, that's a bit more to deal with, but it's still entirely possible. I'm not gonna bet on it though, just because of how Atlus is with certain things, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. And with how Atlus would essentially create a new Persona game and then release the same game again 2 years later with more content, I can definitely see them doing this with Reload. Just like Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden and Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal for some examples. They would essentially just push out the same game but add the Answer, FEMC, and maybe even more story content with added dungeons, just like Golden or Royal did. They would essentially be marketing Persona 3 Reload like it's a brand new game. There's also the fact that remakes in the past couple of years have always seemed to lead more and more into the reimagining sequel side of things rather than a proper remake, most notably the Final Fantasy VII remake. In Final Fantasy VII's case, it would essentially take the original story of Final Fantasy VII, as amazing as that already was, and then it would slightly change things in the remake. From things like changing certain scenarios to more events happening during a certain arc, to characters showing up way earlier than they did originally. It would mostly be the same story with the same plot outcome, but also altered just enough to where it feels like a fresh new experience. It's definitely possible that Reload could take this approach and have certain story beats happen differently. A sign of this could be the new underwater motif shown in all of the trailers, as it's something very new to the series, and definitely new to Persona 3, as the original Persona 3 did not have the underwater motif originally. They more so had the imagery of the color blue, green, the moon, and funnily enough, Tartarus, but nothing retaining to the water or the ocean. In the reveal trailer, there was the first shot being Aigis staring into the distant ocean, and then there was a really stylish menu UI of Makoto plunging his head into the water. Then soon after, there was an abrupt cut to Latin words underwater as well. Then in the second trailer, it starts off with an underwater recording of Yukari's dad speaking about the failed experiments before reaching the surface and transitioning into a pan of Aigis. What could this mean for Persona 3 Reload? I genuinely don't know. What is really interesting is the Latin words that flash throughout the trailer: Hora, Tenebrosa, Dum Spero Spero, and Renaissance. The translation of it meaning, when darkness fills the hour, and while I breathe, I hope to be reborn. This is a very interesting message, given you know what happens at the end of the game. It's also on the official website for Persona 3 Reload. This could very well be alluding to someone in the game because of something that happens at the very end, and it's really interesting that this is the choice of words used for the trailer. In the original opening, Burn My Dread was filled with Latin phrases like Memento Mori, which means to remember your death and to remember that you are mortal. Along with this was more phrases alluding to facing your fears and to not fear death, which retains the dark themes of Persona 3. I actually made a video about that a while ago. There's also a popular rumor that I've seen floating around regarding the name of the remake that I find very interesting. Reload also being the name of the remake could be alluding to something very different than what the original game provided. The metaphor Reload would seemingly be alluding to their Persona summoning evokers, as they are in the shape of a gun, but evokers are just used for Persona summoning and they're not actual guns that can reload. So what if the title of the game is more so referencing reloading as a new game plus save, using the term reload indicating something new this time around as the first shots have already been fired. Though going back to the Latin phrases sprinkled throughout the Reload trailer, I think it could be leading to a bit more than just vague dialogue. So full spoilers for base Persona 3, Persona 3 Fez, and Persona 3 Portable ahead. So at the end of Persona 3, we all know that our protagonist Makoto Yuki dies, and he dies saving the world and giving his life to the Great Seal in order to stop Nyx. We then learn later on that his Velvet Room attendant, Elizabeth, actually had very deep emotions towards him and really wants to save him. This has been hinted at for years now, ever since Persona Q, Persona Arena, and even Persona 4, where in Persona 4's case, after beating Margaret in a secret challenge boss, she would then explain that Elizabeth, her sister, is looking for a way to bring back Makoto from his fate. And in the later spin-off games, you would then learn that she actually left the Velvet Room and Igor in order to save Makoto and find another Great Seal. And in Persona Arena, there's a scene of Elizabeth talking to Margaret about saving Makoto from his fate, but ends up covering it up as a fairy tale just to save herself. It would make a lot of sense for Reload to play out differently, or have Elizabeth play a bigger role this time around, since they have hinted at her saving Makoto for years now, and it really does make me wonder if we'll see anything play out differently. The remake could even be canonically explained as Elizabeth replaying the events to where it leads to a different ending, or a different sacrifice. There's definitely a lot of possibilities and untapped potential for how Atlus can go about Reload, so it's not the end of the world that they aren't adding anything from Portable or Fez yet. Atlus just loves to add content after a game is already released, and we learned through their other projects that DLC and post-launch content is something that they thrive on, which is why I'm not all that worried about the other features that we're missing out on to make this complete and definitive, as they're either coming along soon as DLC or as some upgraded version of Reload. Thankfully, even though this is a remake of the original Persona 3, Atlus has gone on and said that most of the additions from Fez and P3P will be integrated into the remake, like Aigis' social link, new personas, party control, and even more events and little interactions with the characters and other new updates to make the game feel more modern. My only complaint with the marketing is how the devs just keep referring to this as an updated version of Persona 3 that can allow people to have a similar experience to Persona 5. Trust me, I love Persona 5 just as much as Atlus does, but Persona 3 is one of the most dissimilar games in the series in comparison comparison to Persona 5. Persona 3 is dark and gritty and thematically intense at times, with a bittersweet message and a poetic ending that ties everything together. Persona 5 is bright, colorful, and stylish, and also thematically intense at times, but more so focused on the ideology of justice and morality. These are two games of the series that have entirely different stories and themes, and were created in a different time with a different message and for different people. If there was one thing I loved about Persona 3 was its gameplay difficulty, as that game can get very intense and brutal at times, especially for its final boss and mini-bosses. Like most other aspects of Reload, they've already opted for a more modern approach to things, one of which is its gameplay, where the tactics menu, for example, is opted for direct controls, kinda like Persona 4 and 5 are. As someone who actually likes the tactics menu, I was a little worried about this happening, but honestly it was inevitable, as direct commands are the standard for any modern turn-based JRPG at this point. Even at the time that Fez came out and had the whole tactics menu, it was still a bit interesting, as controllable party members have always been the norm. I always appreciated how they integrated the idea of the tactics menu into the gameplay, with how Makoto being the leader of the group doesn't mean he has direct control over his party's lives. When the developers keep comparing Reload to Persona 5, it kinda worries me because I want the game to play and feel like it did originally, just with updated graphics. Having baton passes or fusion alarms are cool, but without proper balancing, it'll just make Reload far too easy to enjoy. Persona 5 is a game that, in my opinion, suffers greatly by having too many accessible features and advantages with no proper enemy balancing to enjoy. Too many abilities with no punishment for certain moves will just lead to an easy game, which is what I hope to avoid with the Reload. It's why, even though I love Persona 5, I think there's a problem when you can gain all of these features and abilities and one-shot the Reaper. There is a lot about this game that I hope they can try to preserve through the remake, and I hope they don't try too hard to appeal to fans of Persona 5 or to make this game more accessible to the modern era. There is a lot of time before this game actually releases, and a lot of the issues that people are having can definitely be fixed within that time period. Personally, I'm mostly hoping for more character development with Ken, as I feel like he was the one character who deserved way more than what he originally got. And I hope they add lots of options for music, as I'm sure they're gonna have a lot of new and remixed tracks, but I hope that the original OST is also preserved and utilized somehow in the remake. Of course, I hope that the people checking out Persona 3 for the first time through this remake will enjoy it, and hopefully they check out the games that came before it, as they are still amazing games, especially Fez.